Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's time for the third panel of the afternoon. Again, it's going to be a mixture of hybrid and in-person papers. I'm afraid at this time of the day, there's no way I'm going to achieve the grace and humour of the previous chairs. So you're going to just bear with me. But hopefully we will have an efficient and lively discussion, efficient chairing and lively discussion as we reach the close of the day. So our first panelist is Mseba at the University of California. He's currently assistant professor at the University of California, Southern California, excuse me. And Admire's work covers a range of areas, but with a very, very strong track record, particularly in environmental history. And today he's going to be talking to us about locusts, and his paper is entitled "The Archival Trail on the History of International Cooperation in Environmental Control: The Case of Locusts in Southern Africa." Admire, whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, for accepting my abstract. And thanks, everybody. My apologies, I couldn't be part of the earlier conversations. It's just after 8 a.m. here on the west coast of the US, so I am just waking up. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So in this paper, I am reflecting on a journey that I took to try and understand the history of cooperation in locust control in 20th century Southern Africa. Locusts, I think for many of us who have been paying attention during the course of the COVID pandemic, were in fact causing serious problems in East Africa and other parts of the Red Sea Basin. I think were it not for COVID, they would have been dominating the news for some time. But for many other people, this is a forgotten plague, though in the course of the 20th century, they really caused a serious problem. And so I was trying to reflect on how this story has told and how I stumbled upon it. So in about 2000, John W. Bahana, who I understand at the time was working for the International Red Locust Control Organization for Central and Southern Africa, headquartered in Zambia, traced the history of this organization. And this organization was established in 1949 as a result of a convention signed between Britain, South Africa, Belgium, Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Britain on behalf of its colonies, Belgium on behalf of its colony in the Congo, to establish an organization that would collectively combat a locust plague, or a plague of red locusts that had been ravaging most of Southern Africa, except the southern most tip of the continent, so sort of the present day western part of the Western Cape. And essentially, he made the point that this organization was formed as a result of 15 years' work, so a work that had been done since the 1930s. And what he referenced was the work of two entomologists, a Belgian entomologist by the name of Hans Brado, and a British entomologist by the name of APG Michael Moore. The two had been delegated to Central Africa by their governments in response to the plague that I've just mentioned. Essentially, he referenced this work as the starting point, and many others had been referencing that, and I'll get to that shortly. A little over 2 decades later, last year, Michael Huboys framed the history of locust control in the British Empire in much the same ways that, same terms that Bahana had put the International Red Locust Control Organization's story. In other applied biological sciences, Huboys notes, policy and innovation moved in the interwar period to the colonial periphery. Locust control and policy, however, remained centralized and were run from the cabinet office, not the colonial office. Geography, politics, and scientific preeminence, together saw the creation of an imperial entomology of locust knowledge. So essentially, he sees this as the work of the imperial government and imperial experts from the imperial metropolis. And likewise, I myself, following a trip and following some help from Lizzie, following a trip to TNA in 2017, I wrote a paper that examined in court the knowledge-based socioeconomic and political factors that prompted cooperation in environmental, by which I meant locust control, and the ideological and the political changes this faced. In the paper, I argued that this, and I quote, the story begins in the 1920s when locust plagues affected Southern Africa as well as the Red Sea shores of the Arabian Peninsula, prompting imperial powers to invest in investigating and preventing their recurrence. My point is that the preeminence that I and these other scholars that I've mentioned accorded to imperial police, policymakers and experts, in fact, reflected the power of institutions in shaping the stories that we tell. Bahana's argument, for instance, was informed by the International Red Locust Control Organization's own institutional memory, and this memory tends to locate the organization's origins and origins of international cooperation to the, in locust control in Southern Africa, to the work of those two entomologists, Bredo and Michael Moore, that were delegated to Central Africa by the two respective imperial governments, Belgium and Britain. Meanwhile, of course, my own argument, like Uboisi, was informed by a different kind of institution, this time TNA, the National Archives, over at Kew. And this archive privileged the work of men who had worked in the Imperial Bureau of Entomology, later the Imperial Institute of Entomology, and in the 1930s, the Anti-Locust Research Center. This like the institutional memory, this archive also privileges the work of those locust workers who had been delegated to the colonies. And the more I read about this, the more it became unsurprising, because the international, these institutions, the Imperial Bureau of Entomology, the Imperial Institute of Entomology, and the Anti-Locust Research Center had played an important role in Britain's belated attempts to address the locust problem in the colonies in the 1930s, and this was essentially in the wake of plagues of different species of locusts that affected most of the empire. At the time that the red locust was ravaged in Southern Africa, there was a plague of desert locust in most of North Africa, East Africa, the Middle East, all the way to India and Pakistan. And so Britain had jumped in to sort of deal with the problems that persisted even during the Second World War. And these organizations received information from these places, synthesized it, and then sent it back to the different parts of the colonies that were affected by the locusts. And of course, they exalted the work that was being performed by the men in the field, as it were. They also, of course, created the Imperial Repository that we are now consulting, that was shaping our story. Yet, I would argue, on closer reading of the same Imperial Archive, together with archives located in the former colonies in South Africa, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and the Food and Agricultural Organization, which later participated much later in the 1970s in the work of locust control in Southern Africa, in the 1950s in the other parts of the world, for reasons that I would be here to talk about, we can begin to see that the initiative, in fact, did not always lie with the imperial government. In fact, the work of cooperation in locust control began way earlier than the 1930s, when the imperial powers, sent their experts to Central Africa. And here I will quickly refer to the slide that I'm sharing with you. Between 2016 and 2019, I was a postdoctoral, student or researcher at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein. This is the south entrance to campus, and just by the gate, if you can see my mouse, is actually the Free State Provincial Archives, as this thing shows. And for those 3 years, I had actually never visited the archives. I had gone to look for locusts in Harare, in London, and in Rome. And I had come back and wrote the story whose argument I just quoted. Then sometime in May 2020, when I was preparing to leave to come to the US, I decided to visit the archive and then to go to Pretoria later. And I arrived at the archive just after about 2 p.m. Before 3, I had bumped into documents that completely persuaded me to consider the story that I was telling. And part of that story was that, and this is just one example of the document, a letter from the Prime Minister of Natal to the Colonial Secretary in the Orange River Colony, in which the Prime Minister of Natal, unprompted not by officials in London, but serving the interests of the settler population in the colony, self-governing colony at the time, inquired if the Orange River Colony was prepared to cooperate with his government in destroying locusts. I quote, "I need hardly point out the value of such work when carried out in a systematic manner. For several years, this government has been expending considerable sums of money in this direction, with the result that every very many thousands of pounds worth of produce has been served to the colony and growers annually. The problem, though, was that the government of Natal, by the time he was writing, were killing about 150,000 swarms of locusts per season. And then the following season, the swarms would reappear again. And it quickly dawned on the officials in Natal that the problem was that the locusts were originating from elsewhere. So even if they killed the swarms in their colony, the next year they reappeared again, and then they spend the same amount of money. And I could only tell this story when I had stumbled upon this archive that I had ignored for 3 years. A few weeks later, I went up to Pretoria, and then I realized that a much bigger initiative than this collaboration between two territories that a few years later would become part of the Union of South Africa had begun again in 1906, several years before the imperial government got involved in the 1920s and 1930s. And this initiative the initiative for this bigger collaboration lay with an individual named C.B. Simpson, then the chief of the entomological division of the Transvaal Department of Agriculture. Charged with combating locusts, he had devised so many ways of trying to know where they were coming from, one of which was to send postcards to different parts of the colony and asking farmers there to send them the postcard back once the locusts had appeared. And it quickly turned out that people in the Western Transvaal were seeing locusts that were coming from across the border in Bechuanaland, and also from the sort of the Karoo and even in Namibia. And so he pushed his government to organize attempts to collaborate with neighboring governments and the Transvaal government quickly escalated the matter with the British High Commissioner to South Africa, who then called in a meeting of entomologists and other officers from all the 4 South African colonies, as well as Southern Rhodesia, Bechuanaland, Basutoland, Swaziland. These officials, after a few days of deliberation, agreed to establish, and I quote, a general bureau be maintained for a period of not less than 5 years. The same delegates also resolved to recommend to the governments of Portuguese East Africa and German West Africa to be invited to cooperate, and then an international locust bureau was established. In 1909, they learned that this bureau, they learned that the locusts were coming from as far north as northwest and northeastern Rhodesia, even Tanganyika, and so they invited these governments again. Essentially, the bureau's function was to collect, tabulate, and distribute reports of locust swarms throughout initially the British South African territories, but also the Portuguese and German colonies once they were incorporated. And so essentially, this bureau was doing the work that the Anti-Locust Research Center would later do in the 1930s. I only learned of its story a little later after I'd already returned from the Imperial, from Kew, where I'd read the archives collected there by the British government from different parts of the empire in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. What is significant, of course, was that the Bureau served the interests of local South African white settlers at the time. In fact, in 1911, a year after Union, the functions of the Bureau was taken over by the division of the Union Division of Entomology, and the members from the 4 South African territories, as well as after Union, the Union government, were quite very conscious of this fact that this whole organization was meant to serve the interests of white South African farmers, especially. They almost let the cat out of the bag, prompting one official eventually to cancel that. It was hardly polite, even if it was true, to say that the original and primary objective of the Bureau, to which they were asked to and did contribute, was to ensure the cooperation of the 4 colonies now included in the Union. This was at a point when somebody in the South African government wanted to tell the neighboring governments in the other colonies what the function of this Bureau was. Of course, they had faced several problems, labor, the ineffectiveness of the other measures that they had used. Fast forward to the 1920s, the locust plague appears, and it is quite true that in this particular period, the imperial government becomes involved in the work of locust control for selfish reasons. For example, there had been a plague of locusts that had been going on, or at least there had been serious locust invasions in Bechuanaland in the 1920s and 30s. And the British government had tried to persuade South Africa to help in combating those pests. And the South African government essentially refused for what it saw as the attempt by the imperial government to help it subsidize its imperial venture in this territory. But in the 1930s, in the wake of this locust plague, Britain and Belgium, as I pointed out already, sent its entomologists. It played the role that I pointed out earlier. But it is also quite clear that framing the work of locust control, even during the interwar period, is an initiative of the imperial government and experts from the imperial metropolis is not necessarily wrong, but it's impartial. And I think so many studies have shown that, the work of knowing knowing African environments and African people by anthropologists included both people in the colonies and the experts from outside. And so these two slides show, on the one hand here, the exaltation again of the imperial entomologists. But on the other slide here, on this other slide, on the other slide, it showed actually that the work of investigating locusts, even in the 1940s, was done by Black Zambians, not the entomologists themselves, who spent most of their time desk-bound. But that collaboration between entomologists from Britain and Belgium continued well into the 1960s, and then it was rocked by African nationalism. Of course, Britain and Belgium began to take a backseat as they withdrew from empire. The cooperation collapsed totally in 1970 when the independent states of Southern Africa refused to cooperate with South Africa, Rhodesia, the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique. And essentially, this last slide, as I'm wrapping up, what it shows is introduction of new experts. This is from the Food and Agriculture Organization, highlighting the absence of trained experts from the newly independent governments, to the extent that they approached FAO to bring in some experts, and the sole expert that they could find to coordinate locust control was from Kenya, who was hired in 1972. Thank you so much.
And for the next presentation, as I'm going to slide, we have Professor Ismael here from Illinois University, and who will be looking at this question of kind of institutional history and archives and environment from a different angle, exploring the effects of the Harmattan Haze on the public records and archives administration in Tamale, Ghana. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Okay. Oh, thank you. So as Elizabeth explained, my presentation is going to revolve around the theme of the effect of Harmattan on the British British colonial administrative record, the public record and archive administration, known briefly as PRAAD Tamale. And this is the PRAAD regional, the headquarters that was built during the colonial time and remains so till today. And the picture you see here is the first president of the Republic of Ghana after formerly Gold Coast attained its independence, and thereafter the country will, along with British colonial administrators, will embark on a path to rescue or create what will become our cherished heritage. And for that reason, I'd like to start my presentation by thanking the conference organizers for making it possible for me to present this paper. And also because of the genesis of my presentation, which stemmed from a grant support from the Endangered Archive Program which I also wish to express my gratitude for its support, and particularly to Judy Butterwood, who is here in attendance, who has been a major part of the second part of the project, because the project started with pilot and then major projects. So between 2009 and 2016, with a pilot project and 2 major grants from the British Library Endangered Archive Program, I set out with a research team based in Tamale, northern Ghana, and we digitized up to 199 separate record collection, comprising over 3,280 files aimed at rescuing these colonial and administrative records. These records were threatened due to inadequate facilities for conservation, overuse, and deterioration from humidity and other hazards of tropical climate, particularly Harmattan Haze, which can be severe in northern Ghana. Despite the digitization that has taken place, I am certain that intensification of climate change and the physical protection and preservation of the PRAAD, colonial, and historical records warrant more than ever an equal attention in order to balance digitization with physical conservation and preservation. My paper, therefore, seeks to reassess the extent to which the Harmattan Haze and other climate factors contribute to the rapid deterioration of the colonial and historical record at PRAAD in Tamale, and to explore possible remedies to preserve them from further deterioration. So just a snapshot of what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to provide a historical context of this record, and then we'll touch on effects of the Harmattan Haze, focusing on 2 main factors in the interest of time, and also what effect did it have on the PRAAD staff and what can be done beyond digitization. And just to give you a feel of what the impact of the Harmattan Haze is on this record, I have, so this stemmed from just one session of digitization. When I was doing the project, I was witnessing it at some point, just said, you know what, I just need to, I had no idea that, I just said, this is way too much. And I grabbed them, took them back with me to the US. And so when Jody informed me about this conference, I couldn't find it, more relevant for me to come and talk about the impact. So what I'm going to do, I'll just pass this as I present, and then you can see if you even open like many of the paper, they'll just disintegrate like that. So first, a word about the Harmattan, its features and characteristics. So this is an illustration of the wind pattern that creates and blow Harmattan into, this is the area, this shaded area is where the project, that's where around Tamale is based, and that's where the project is also based. So we'll be talking, my discussion kind of centered around that area. But what's Harmattan? Harmattan is a dry and dusty wind that blows across West Africa, particularly in the region known as the Sahel. It is most commonly experienced between the months of November through March each year. In a typical year, the changes in weather, ecology, and amount of daylight result from Earth orbit around the sun and the sun axial tilt relative to ecliptic plane. Thus, in the temperate and subpolar regions of the Earth, we have 4 seasons as it is experienced in places like here. We have spring, summer, autumn, and then spring, summer, autumn, and winter. However, in tropical or subtropical regions, which West Africa and for that matter Ghana is part of, we're talking of 2 main seasons. Mainly rainy season, when you experience wet or monsoon season, and then we have the dry season, which translates into Harmattan. Harmattan dust constitute haze, largely from anthropogenic source of particular matter. Most scholars note that the Harmattan and wind originate in the Sahara, as indicated here, and blow southwards towards the Gulf of Guinea. It is also known as the northeast trade wind that blows over North Africa as a result of the continental scale pressure gradient between subtropical subsidence zone and the metropolitan convergence zone. During that period, storm activities in particular part of the Sahara area, which is currently, one would say, around Chad, Bilma, Faya Largo, and Tibessa area. During this time, you see wind that will kind of blew all the way to northern part of Ghana. During the Harmattan season, the weather is characterized by occurrence of low precipitation. Rainfall became almost very, very limited, if not existent, because that is the dry season, not the rain season. Another thing had to do with quality of the wind. Wind become very, very dry, exacerbated by heat. And low humidity is another characteristic and feature of the Harmattan season, particularly in the areas of northern Ghana, which is different when compared to the southern part of Ghana, because the closer you move to the south, the closer you are to the Atlantic Ocean, which in turn also produce, different kind of weather that moderate the extent of the effect of the Harmattan. That is not to say you will not experience Harmattan in southern part of Ghana, Kumasi, Tamale. You will, but the intensity is far less when compared to the northern areas. So overall, temperatures experienced during Harmattan season in northern Ghana vary on several factors, including the specific location, time of the day, and the severity of the Harmattan wind. During Harmattan season, the average daily temperature in northern Ghana usually range around 20 degrees or 68 Fahrenheit to 30 degrees or 86 Fahrenheit. However, it's important to note that temperatures can occasionally drop below 20 degrees and during cooler part of the day in areas with higher altitude in particular. Morning and evening during the Harmattan tend to be cooler than the rest of the day. And it is not uncommon for early morning and late evening to have temperatures also that range between 15 degrees and 20 degrees Celsius. So before I delve into the discussion of the effect of the Harmattan, Haze on the PRAAD record. I want to spend the next few minutes outlining the historical significance of the PRAAD record so that we might appreciate the full scope of the Harmattan Haze on these records. The Public Record and Archive Administration PRAAD office in Northern Region, formerly known as the Archive, the National Archive of Ghana, was established in 1961 at the Northern Regional Administrative Office, which is today known as NRCC abbreviation. With the promulgation of the Archive Ordinance of 1955 and the regulation of 1958, the National Archive of Ghana, which has been established by the Gold Coast Colonial Administration in Accra, the building that I showed earlier on, embarked on a nationwide and extensive effort to sort, organize, classify, and label documents that were pertinent to 3 areas of northern territories of the Gold Coast. Because at the time, Ghana was such that, when it was a colony, it was such that it was administered. So you have the Northern Territory, and then you have the Gold Coast area, and then you have the Asante area. So all documents relating to the Northern Territories, 3 different regions at the time were brought together and to be administered under these gentlemen here. The first known as J.M. Akita, who was the creator, who was delegated to create and oversee the creation of PRAAD office in Tamale, and then Dr. Kumi, Mr. Kumi, was appointed as the first regional director of PRAAD to administer those records. So these records that were created can be classified into 5 main groups. The first group that has to do with land tenure. Again, this is one of the most important things, and I believe it will be the same for much of colonial Africa, in that colonization involved a lot of land administration. Chieftaincy and native affairs, for most of you, or those of you who are familiar with British colonial history in West Africa, the question of the indirect rule was very important and instrumental, and we see a lot of that played out here. And then administrative reports, the district and provincial administrators will write, report, and send to the British Commissioner, and then he will send also intent. So there is that kind of exchange, informal diaries and minutes of meetings. Of all these records, especially the first 2, they have been, because of their relevance to post-independent political dynamics, they have been human factors. When 2 groups, for political reasons, sometimes don't get along, one party or a person who belongs to one party, especially these first 2, land tenure and chieftaincy and native administration, people will go and kind of tore papers from those archives. However, the effect of climate kind of trumped that. And one of the first effect of climate, as I already shown the features, characteristic of Harmattan, results from the dryness and the dust that it will infuse into these documents. So the dry and dust conditions associated with Harmattan are detrimental to, has been detrimental to the record and the papers that are contained within this record. These papers became susceptible to drying out and therefore become brittle, which lead to increased fragility and ultimately damage. So what I showed here was just a result of witnessing, or experiencing, that kind of effect of the climate. The dry air also causes pages to cling together, resulting in tears of loss. So sometimes the dry dust, it makes it very difficult to open 2 pages. And if you try hard to open it, the result is just going to be losing those documents. And there were a lot of that. The dust accumulates on the surface of the material, covers them, and can even make the paper degrade at a faster rate. Moreover, the dust and dirt particles that settle in the paper fiber and blend can leave the mat and stain that can be challenging to remove. Not to mention also the coloring effect that if you look at some of these papers, I believe initially they were different color, white, but over a period of time, the dust that accumulates change them in color and in texture as well. The second factor I want to touch on has to do with the temperature and humidity. The change in temperature and humidity as a result of the Harmattan Haze can result in moisture going also out of paper and leading to shrinkage and causing further damage. Low humidity levels may also cause paper to lose its natural oil, making it brittle and prone to cracking, tearing, and increased porosity. If any of you have experienced life in tropical Africa where Harmattan is, prevails, I was hoping to show papers, some images illustrating its effect on humans. So you see the crack, toes, human body. You look at the soil sometimes can just crack. And I think I'm not sure if it was David's presentation or others that kind of, showed examples of, soil cracking. So that level is very, very prominent. And also the haziness of Harmattan. Flight, it affects visibility. So flight from Tamale to Accra sometimes can be grounded for a week until the Harmattan settles down. And the same thing also can happen on the ground, causing accidents and the like. So this is just a brief kind of example of the Harmattan Haze on the record. What about the people who work on the archive? So this is one of the archivists that I work with who has long retired, Mr. Husseini. One of the causes of Mr. Husseini's retirement had to do with health issues, and it was directly related to occupational hazard. Because this guy, he spent all his life working in the archive. He's just the archive. If you, for the time period that he worked there for more than 20 years, people who visited, he was the one that they will remember when they are there or they leave. So occupational, respiratory challenges stemming from sneezing, wheezing, cough, asthma symptoms, and dizziness, depending also on the level of heat at the time, can cause, their challenges on their archivists working in the archive. So the question now is, what can be done? Oh, have 2 minutes. I'm almost getting there. So the thing with the record here is that it is not, I mean, when putting this paper and presentation together, some of the best practices that I come to learn in terms of conservation and preservation sometimes is, I think my next slide. So if you look at the boxes, these boxes are very well, they are thick. And inside the boxes, then you have the record that are also wrapped in something, right? So this is one way to preserve the archive. But nevertheless, because of other factors, frequent electricity, and of course, intensity of the Harmattan Haze, etc., it has not been enough to kind of safeguard these records. So here, this is what I was, so you see these records here, they are put within boxes like this, some of these boxes that then are put into larger boxes, but nevertheless, still. And here's where I learn a lot from David's presentation, in the sense that what I'm hoping and I'm going to do in the next stage for this paper is to be able not just to look at the papers breaking, but try to find a method in which to scientifically kind of assess, over a period of time, either based on the intensity, severity of the Harmattan occurrence in this region, so that one can measure and maybe get an idea as to what extent it's able to affect these. So conservation-wise, this is the PRAAD headquarters in Accra, where a limited number of conservation is done. However, for the regional directorate offices, like the one at Tamale, we do not have that kind of leisure. So the question remains, what can be done when thinking of short-term and long-term solutions, incentivize record staff to use nose masks, goggles, and shields, for their occupational health and the like. And for long-term, institute and apply electronic and digital filing system, storage and retrieval technology. However, these in itself come with its own challenge. And when I talk also about my last point in terms of trying to find a method, that method has to take into account the frequent electricity outage, because without which, no matter what you do, you are still going to face this problem. Because the question that remains for me is, how come these levels of protection of these documents within these boxes are still, prone to the hazard of tropical climate from the Harmattan. So with that, I will leave it here in the interest of time, and thank you for your attention.
We're now going to return online to our final panelists for today. Livingstone Muchefa, who is currently the Curator for Education and Public Programming at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, after being the archivist at the National Archives of Zimbabwe from 2008 to 2020. And today, greeting, hello. Can you hear us, Livingstone?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so yes, and this afternoon, Livingstone will be speaking to the title Complementary and Competing but Neglected, Understanding the State of Private Environmental Archives in Zimbabwe, using Boulton, Atlantica Foundation. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. And good evening to everyone. I'm sorry, it's evening this side now. My presentation is going to be very brief, I'm sure. So my presentation is really going to be about this specific case study, which is the Boulton Atlantica Foundation, which is about 15 kilometers out of the capital city of Harare. But maybe before I give my introduction, I just need to give it a context as to how I discovered that there was such an institution. I was still working in the archives, in the public archives and research section, and it was around 2011, 2010, thereabout. So we had one researcher who came to the archives. The lady was actually working on very interesting issues around environment and African birds, specifically Zimbabwean birds. So when she came to the archives, we were trying to give as much possible information as we could in terms of what we have in the archive. Then later on, she came back again and said, oh, you guys, I think you don't know what you are missing. There's this institution just close to your institution here, less than 20 kilometers. I think it would be good if you have a look at it, do a survey, and bring all the collection into the archives because no one is taking care of it. So we drove together to the place, Boulton Atlantica Foundation, which is about just 15 kilometers off the town. When we got there, I was surprised. There were about between 18 and 22 cubic footage of very historical records, but they were very, very deteriorating state. But some of them, they were still okay. We then tried to find out how we could officially transfer these records from that place into the archive. Then we started getting some references as to the family members of the Boulton family. Some could say these were the friends and all that. It took us about a year and a half to try and get to the bottom of it to officially transfer these manuscripts into the archive. But in between that period, when we were trying to transfer this collection into the main archive, what was unfortunate is that we kind of raised or sensationalized the issue to the point that the institution falls within the premises of the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Authority, which is an institution in Zimbabwe which looks after environmental issues, but largely flora and fauna. So they had to say, okay, this is within our premise, well, let's take it, everything. We didn't know. And then they took everything to their place. We didn't know. So later on, we couldn't find anything in terms of all those records as to refer to. So that this is the background, how I came to know that there was actually some very insightful information, but which was being neglected. So I'll just give that context. And as part of my introduction, I would say I had to quote Kwashirai, who is a Zimbabwean scholar, who says the roots of the key features of African environmental historiography lies in colonial capitalism and imperialism. For him, his emphasis is really on the activities of the Western powers during colonization period, which also translates to how an official archive was established in Zimbabwe through the adventures of what we call the 1933 National Historical Committee, which was basically interested in documenting and preserving the records of the pioneer column in the BSA company. But here specifically, I'm going to be concentrating on this Boulton Atlantica Foundation, which was established in 1959 by Rudyard Boulton, who was an ornithologist from America. I would want to say, before I get into the details of this, I just want to give a context also to say, I think there's a conundrum of defining what environmental archives are. It's not always the case that everyone understands what we mean by environmental archives. But maybe we could borrow it from the concept of a military museum, where it's actually dedicated to aviation, military, and warfare issues. But this is not the case with environmental archives. We could say environmental archives are end records, whether in bits and pieces or small or large quantities that are just to do with environmental archives, as long as they've got evidential, legal, and administrative value. As well as to also talk about, in the context of colonization, multinational companies, which are records about mining, explorations, agriculture, and other issues. Back to Boulton Atlantica Foundation, which was established in 1959, like I said. This was at a time when African nationalism was really at the peak in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. But a few years later, the center was very strategic for many environmental training and research programs in Zimbabwe, DRC, Malawi, Tanzania, and Mozambique, which led to the growth of a very big collection on environment. Boulton was a specialist in documenting birds and butterflies. So this is how then the records got to develop and got to be big and big in terms of the collection. But a few years later, in 1965, there was unilateral declaration of independence by Smith. And in the peak of those politics between London and Rhodesia, Boulton was implicated in the politics, and he gave up his work. Then left Zimbabwe for good. But his resignation was not just polite to say, it was out of his benevolence to say, because there is a lot of intensification of nationalism and so forth. It was also discovered that he was actually a CIA agent. In this image, these two photographs that I've just said, on the left, it's him and an assistant photographer photographing a bird. And on the right is trying to operate, he's operating his parabolic reflector, which was used to collect and record the birds of sound. But him being a CIA agent in Southern Africa, a lot of the destabilization political issues were then linked to him. So this was really sad. And to date, part of what he has gathered in terms of his information and some of the butterflies and the birds that they were gathering, there is also the assumption that much of it was transferred to South Africa. But the negligence is not just out of the fact that Boulton then left Zimbabwe. But it was also, some would want to argue that most early curators were really amateurs. They just worked or did this kind of conservation and museum work, tried to do it, the archival work, just as volunteers, but they were not professionals. Some would call them antiquarians, some would call them amateur, whatever it is. But to some, this is just an excuse to justify why some of the records were looted and why some of them are missing right now. And to verify and also to make this justification or this excuse justifiable. In the National Museums and Monuments, there was George Arnold, who was the director in Bulawayo for the Natural Museums. As early as 1911, up to 1947, he was the director. When he went back to London in 1947, he met one of his old friends, who was Henry Noble Smithers, who was just coming out of the war of the Second World War. He was a soldier and said, please, you should come to Zimbabwe. You should come to Rhodesia. I want you to be the curator. And he actually became the next head curator in the Bulawayo Natural Museums. So here I'm just trying to shape up the road why there was this beautiful collection which then got neglected. So the quitting of Boulton himself, right, is the first step. But my second point is that I would want to quote Nance Jacobs in his 2015 publication to say, field biologists count on being indulged for their use of surveillance equipment. Their work provides good cover, and some scientists have taken advantage of it for spying. And this is exactly true about Boulton, who was later unmasked as a veteran CIA agent. And from that point, the management of the collection starts crumbling. But on the other hand, there was a very complementary institution, the museums, which had a very close relationship with Boulton. They also developed their own entomology department and started collecting, also documenting on the other side, birds, butterflies, and many other insects. And to date, they have got more than 5 million of these specimens. So, after the resignation of Boulton, it started going on the collapsing side. No one is taking care of the collection. No one is bothered and others. So in this image here on the left, this is like 1960 image. You can see very beautiful infrastructure by those standards and by that time. But on the right side, now I'm not interested in the infrastructure as it looks today. But just to say, the space now is being advertised as you get closer to the place, just along the highway. It's now for conferences, picnics, weddings, events, and conservation education. But this is like purely now some leisure facilities, no more research, no more information center, no more archival services. So, how do we describe the collapse? We have to take note of the competing narratives, especially in Africa and Zimbabwe. And in the context of espionage and political infiltration, sanctions and economic wars, the environment and the NGOs, which is how often the role that has been played by private players, individuals, and companies that are coming from the West within a political context like Zimbabwe. Things are starting from the year 2000 after the land reform program. The relationship between NGOs, Western-sponsored, Western-owned institutions in whatever capacity in terms of their mandate got on the deterioration side, started deteriorating. I'll give an example of the CITES which banned the sale of ivory. Of course, it's the whole of Africa. But Zimbabwe has always said we have got plenty of this ivory. And this is within the same institution, ZimParks, the Parks and Wildlife that have been mentioned, which is actually presiding over the mandate of the Boulton Atlantica institution. They are recording that they've got more than 136 metric tons of ivory in rhino horn. We should sell to fund our operations and even upkeeping of this infrastructure. So because CITES has got these very, solid and firm regulations, they can't. So there's been that also political and deliberate negligence on all institutions that are driving their mandate and inspiration from Western origins. And I would just want to give some legal gaps and rules of further negligence within that context. Of course, the National Archives exist, which falls under the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Cultural Heritage. But if you also look in South Africa, the same National Archives with a similar mandate falls under another department, which is Arts and Culture. Of course, is the naming side. But within Zimbabwe itself, there are other 3 ministries apart from the ones that the archives follows under. The first one is what is called the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism, and Hospitality, which the Department of Parks and Wildlife falls under. And they've got a lot of responsibility over environmental issues, which also include another entity which is called Environmental Management Agency, abbreviated as EMA. We also have Ministry of Mines and Mining Development, and the Lands, Agriculture, Water, Fisheries, and Road Development, which were specifically in this context more to do with the upkeep, generation, and archiving of all environmental aspects. But as complementary work, there are other players in the game. Like I mentioned, the National Archives, but there's also the Meteorological Department archives. They've got their own private archive. The Zimparks and Wildlife has got their information center, but unfortunately, as we speak today, trying to trace the Boulton collection within the Zimparks and Wildlife Information Center, I could not get half of a cubic footage of information that relates to the center and the information that I had seen 11 years ago. In 2010, I had seen more than 20, around 22 cubic foot of very valuable information about Boulton, Atlantica. But this year or last year, 2022, we tried to locate this information. We couldn't get just a single box. But outside Zimbabwe, we understand there are also multinational corporations and their colonial records. And some of these records are also now in the digital or virtual space. And coming in to fill this space, we've got now private environmental societies such as the Bird Society. Kuimba Shiri is also a sanctuary for local birds. The Matopos Conservation Society. So in conclusion, what am I saying? What is the state of Boulton Atlantica Foundation archives? Zimparks taking charge of this collection, which was more than 20 cubic footage, now has got just half a cubic footage, and which is mostly, that half footage is mostly conference papers, nothing more. All the research about birds, all the research about butterflies, all the research about infrastructure, all the research about local people's relationship with the nature and everything, like we had peeped into those papers, nothing exists so far. The entire collection and the entire staff at the Boulton Atlantic Foundation now has no idea what took place, where these papers are, what information was there. They have no idea, except just a few veteran officers at the parks. What used to be a national treasure is now nowhere to be located. So, in rounding up, I would just want to say the whole collection, which was really unique because Zimbabwe didn't have sanctuaries on insects, birds, and these other small creatures. The only complementing responsibility to that effect was the Natural Museums, which was established in Bulawayo. But because of this very terrible now relationship that we currently have, which is not as early as 1960s or before independence, because Zimbabwe got independence in 1980. This is something that just worsened after the 2000 period, where Zimbabwe embarked on a land reform program and moved out of the Commonwealth, and sanctions began. And this kind of relationship then affected on all these other environmental institutions that were concerned, that were working as agencies or that aided to the posterity and preservation of these very important environmental archives. So what we are now left with is something that is just a record coming from the government, from the official, from the public office. The private players have really been seriously affected, and it is now very difficult to locate and make use of even the information that you used to know it exists somewhere. So in my presentation, I've been trying to look at such an example of how politics can affect, even if Boulton was really an agent of the CIA, his work was really going to be useful for today's research outside the context of the politics of the day. The politics of the 2000s have actually worsened in terms of the deterioration and the entire or the vanishing of the entire collection now. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think in summary, this is what my presentation is all about. Thank you once again.